He was preferred. The Labor was going to win, enough seats to have a comfortable, albeit thin, majority. On election night, all that went out the window. Now, for reasons that seem obvious in hindsight, Bill Shorten lost. Remember, he was going after franking credits and he was going after negative gearing and he was telling coal miners one thing in Queensland and then trying to be a greenie when he was down in Melbourne. And people saw through it, and that night, on election night, they voted for the coalition much more than the polls had suggested they would. Our next guest was one of a very small handful of pollsters who correctly predicted that Scott Morrison would win the election. She is a data strategist and economist at Maven Data. Elisa Choi, good afternoon.
Hi, how are you?
Well, I'm very good, thank you. So just quickly, tell us how you reach your conclusions. You don't do conventional polling, do you?
No, I don't do polling at all. So a correction, I'm not a pollster. I'm actually a researcher using artificial intelligence and the internet as my data set.
Okay. So what exactly does that mean? I mean, when you say you use the internet, what do you do?
Okay, so when we are analysing the election, we're looking at the top issues that are predicted to sway voters, and that's through measuring emotion in the content that people are engaging with online in relation to these issues. So imagine when everybody is, no doubt right now, reading news, reading posts on social media, talking about it online, we are analysing all of those behaviours and the content online outside a firewall. So this is petabytes of data that we are processing, and a petabyte has 10 to the power of 15, or 1 with 15 zeros behind it.
True.
So that's a lot of data that we process to measure sentiment.
And do you sort of look at the language, like how passionate or vigorous people's language is when they're talking about political issues or political leaders?
100%. So part of the method within artificial intelligence is natural language processing, or to be basic, it's called computational linguistics. So we're using computers to understand language, and there's a lot of language in terms of the words used and the tone, and also we're measuring emotions. So when we're understanding whether an issue is important or not, we're also looking at how it's talked about online and how people engage with that content online, because it's the emotions that we measure that will indicate a future change in behaviour.
Okay, and just very quickly, 3 years ago, you predicted using this approach that Bill Shorten would lose. Why did the pollsters that you are not one of, why did they get it so wrong?
Pollsters fundamentally are asking for people's opinions. And aside from the fact that they're using small samples to represent a large population, fundamentally, when you're asking a person an opinion, they may not tell you the truth for one reason or another. There's also unconscious bias, and we see that a lot, particularly when it comes to elections, because they're quite emotive topics.
Okay, well, let's deal with this upcoming election, which I know you've had a close look at. Now, firstly, the party that seems to have the most money to spend on advertising is the United Australia Party. How do you think they'll go?
Looking at the data, the United Australia Party are looking like they are a real contender to upset this election. And what I mean by that is it's showing that there's strong engagement with the UAP brand and Clive Palmer, pretty much akin to the Labor and Greens as a brand nationally. So their key messages around freedom and anti-government and anti-vaccine, it's actually resonating quite strongly. And it's similar to what we're seeing with the vaccine mandate, which is still a relevant issue in this election.
Okay. Now, what about the Greens? We've spoken a lot about the so-called teal independents who are very climate-focused in seats like Kooyong and Goldstein here in Melbourne. But we haven't heard much from the Greens at all. How are they faring?
That's exactly the assessment we found as well. The Greens are very much what we call loved and have strong positive sentiment, but they aren't cutting through. Their messages are not cutting through or engaging. However, there still remains high expectation amongst voters as to what the Greens can say in relation to climate change. But for one reason or another, they haven't been engaging and they haven't cut through. So our assessment is that the Greens in this election are lost in the woods.
Right. Now, does your data and your analysis say anything about the so-called teal independents who look like giving the Liberals a hard time?
Yes, I'm starting to see that the key themes that are not addressed by the two major parties but are addressed by the independents is actually giving the independents cut through in this election. So in this stage of the election campaign, which is 2 weeks out, we're still focusing on the key election issues and also where the parties fare. Next week, I'll be looking very closely at key seats and key independents. But from what I gather right now, I can see that there's a rise of the independents.
Okay, well, that's not what Josh Frydenberg and Tim Wilson want to hear. And finally, what about the two big parties, Labor first and then the Coalition? How are they faring?
Labor as a brand is still very relevant, but again, it's not making deep impact because it lacks emotional intensity. We're looking for emotional intensity here, strong love or strong fear or strong hate or strong positive emotions and negative emotions. If you're not creating that emotional intensity, it signals that people are they don't really care about what you're saying. And that's a disappointment for Labor.
And that's interesting, isn't it? Because one thing about Bill Shorten is he did create emotional intensity, albeit of the wrong sort. But you're saying that Anthony Albanese does not?
Correct.
Okay. And finally, what about Scott Morrison?
Scott Morrison, well, there's two parts to that story. There's the Scott Morrison factor and there's also the Liberal National Party factor. Firstly, with the party, the brand Liberal National Party is still very strong. In fact, we see it as the strongest party brand nationally, and that means that we have high expectation and strong positive sentiment, as well as some strong negative sentiment. We also see that the National Party affiliation is dragging down its brand. So I wouldn't rule out the party, the Coalition Party. Now, looking at Morrison, that's a different story. There are certain key narratives where he rates very intensely negative towards, and those are, for example, Morrison and women and Morrison and trust.
Okay, that's interesting. Yeah, and that I think would resonate with people, and certainly what's happened in the past couple of years. Look, I know I said finally before, but do you have a result that you think is likely for the election as to who is going to form government?
At this stage, I still am consistent with my view that it won't be a Labor landslide. If Labor does have a chance to win, it would be through the help of the Independents and the Greens. However, I wouldn't be ruling out the Liberal National Party at this stage because their brand is still very strong, despite Morrison having negative sentiment towards him as Prime Minister.
It's been fascinating. Thank you so much. Alyssa Choi, data strategist and economist at Maven Data. Well, that's very interesting. And again, looking at the intensity of language which surrounds political discussion. And remember, and another comment she made, I think, which was fascinating, was that, pollsters get it wrong because people lie. Often when you tell a pollster something, or you might make it up, or you just might say what you're thinking at that point in time, but it's different to what you do in the privacy of the polling booth. But when you're online, and if you're one of those people that likes to make comments and things on social media, you tend to say what you really think. And that's what they analyse. Well, so the options are Labor has a chance of victory, but only with the Greens and the Teal Independents. But she said don't rule out a return to coalition government. 133693, anything you would like to discuss at 4:19.
3AW.